You are home early, Thomas.
The fields are ready for rain. Wake up, William. Let us begin the morning chores, my boy. We are almost to the well, William.
I can carry the bucket, Father.
Keep holding on, William. Steady now, my good beast. Good morning to you both! And to you, Thomas! And to you, Thomas! May God bless your harvest!
Mother!
After only a short meal, the family's work began once again. There was never enough time to rest. Firewood had to be gathered before sunset, animals still needed care, and broken tools always demanded repair. Every afternoon brought another list of tasks that could not be postponed until tomorrow. For medieval peasants, wasting anything was almost impossible. Torn clothing was stitched again and again. Broken baskets were repaired instead of replaced. Even worn wooden bowls remained useful for many years because buying new possessions was beyond the reach of most families. Children were rarely free to spend the day playing. From an early age they learned practical skills that would one day keep them alive. Carrying water, collecting eggs, feeding animals, and helping with cooking were simply ordinary parts of childhood. As the afternoon slowly faded, preparations for the evening quietly began. water simmered above the fire. Bread was sliced for supper, and tired hands continued working until the last daylight finally disappeared beyond the fields. For a medieval peasant family, the end of the day brought no luxury, only quiet gratitude. If everyone returned home safely, the animals were healthy, and there was enough food for one more meal, they considered themselves fortunate. Tomorrow, the same demanding routine would begin all over again. As darkness slowly settled over the village, work did not end immediately. Animals still needed one final check before nightfall. A forgotten gate or an empty feeding trough could mean disaster by morning. Every evening, Thomas made one last walk around the farm before returning inside. Inside the cottage, Agnes quietly prepared everything for another long night. Fresh water was placed beside the beds. Tomorrow's bread dough rested beneath a linen cloth, and the last glowing embers in the hearth would keep the family warm until morning. Without candles to waste, most peasant families depended on the fading firelight. Conversations became quieter, children grew sleepy, and the cottage slowly fell into silence long before midnight. Sleeping was rarely comfortable. Straw mattresses were thin, blankets were rough, and cold drafts often found their way through the wooden walls. Yet after a full day of exhausting labor, even the simplest bed could feel like a place of peace. Outside, the medieval village became completely still. Only the wind, distant owls, and the occasional bark of a dog disturbed the quiet night. Before sunrise arrived once again, the family would rest for only a few precious hours before another demanding day began. Long before the first rays of sunlight reached the village, Thomas was already awake. Medieval peasants could not afford to sleep late. The seasons controlled every hour of their lives, and every minute of daylight was too valuable to waste. The first task every morning was to bring life back into the hearth. Without a warm fire, there would be no breakfast, no warm water, and no comfort against the cold morning air. Outside, the village slowly began to wake. Thin columns of smoke rose above thatched rooftops, roosters called across the fields, and neighbors quietly stepped outside to begin another demanding day. There was little variety in a peasant's breakfast. Most mornings began with coarse rye bread, simple porridge, and fresh water or weak ale. Meat was a rare luxury, often saved for special occasions rather than ordinary days. For this family, every sunrise meant another chance to survive. Their lives were built on discipline, hard work, and hope that the harvest would be good enough to carry them through another year. It was a difficult life, but to them it was simply life. By late morning, the sun stood higher over the fields, but the work only became harder. Every furrow had to be finished before the weather changed. A single afternoon of heavy rain could wash away days of exhausting labor, leaving an entire family uncertain about the coming harvest. The weather ruled every decision a peasant made. There were no forecasts, no warnings, and no guarantees. Families watched the sky as carefully as they watched their crops, hoping the clouds would pass without bringing destruction. Even on difficult days, there was little choice but to continue. A delayed harvest meant less food for winter, and a poor season could leave an entire village hungry before spring ever arrived. Neighbors often depended upon one another. When one family struggled, another might lend a hand for the day, knowing that one day they too would need the same kindness in return. By the time the afternoon sun began its slow descent, the family paused for only a few quiet moments. Their work was far from finished, but even a brief rest beneath the open sky offered a small reward after hours of relentless labor. The afternoon slowly gave way to evening, but the family's work was still unfinished. Every bundle of grain gathered today meant one more meal during the harsh winter months. Nothing could be left behind in the field. As the last bundles were loaded onto the cart, Thomas paused for a moment to look across the fields. Every successful harvest brought a small sense of relief, but no peasant could ever be certain that the coming winter would be kind. Survival depended on careful planning, hard work, and a little good fortune. The long journey home was often the quietest part of the day. Exhaustion settled into tired muscles, yet there was satisfaction in seeing the cart filled with grain. Every bundle represented days of labor, and another small hope for surviving the winter ahead. Back at the cottage, there was still no time to relax. The harvest had to be stored safely before moisture or hungry animals could ruin it. Even after hours in the fields, the day's work continued without pause. As the sun disappeared beyond the hills, the familiar smell of wood smoke drifted through the village once again. Every household prepared the evening meal, grateful for another day that had ended without tragedy. Dinner was rarely luxurious, but it was enough. Thick vegetable stew, dark rye bread, onions, and a little cheese reminded the family that even simple food could feel like a blessing after a day of relentless work. When supper was over, the cottage finally became quiet. The children listened as Thomas shared old village stories passed down through generations. In a world without books for ordinary peasants, stories were one of the few treasures that could be shared freely. Outside, the village had grown almost silent. Only the distant hoot of an owl, the rustling wind through the trees, and the crackling fire inside the cottage broke the stillness. For medieval peasants, these quiet evenings were rare moments of peace before another demanding day began. Before going to bed, Thomas always checked the animals one final time. Losing a cow or sheep during the night could mean disaster for the entire family. Their livestock was not simply property, it was their future. Inside the cottage, Agnes carefully prepared everything for the next morning. Bread dough rested beneath a linen cloth, clean wooden bowls were stacked neatly, and tomorrow's chores were already waiting before anyone had fallen asleep. One by one, the family settled onto their simple straw beds. There were no soft mattresses or feather pillows. After endless hours of labor, even a bed of straw offered enough comfort to fall asleep within moments. Tomorrow would begin exactly as today had. Before sunrise, the family would wake once again to tend their animals, prepare their meals, and work the fields. Such was the rhythm of life inside a medieval peasant's home. A life built on endurance, family, and hope. During the colder months, nights inside the cottage could become painfully cold. Thick stone walls and wooden timbers offered only limited protection against freezing winds. The family slept close together, sharing blankets and the fading warmth of the hearth. Winter brought another challenge: fuel. Every piece of firewood had to last as long as possible. A family that ran out of wood before spring often faced freezing nights with very little hope of staying warm. Even before breakfast, the family was already preparing for another day of work. Medieval life allowed little time for comfort. Every sunrise marked the beginning of another struggle to provide food, warmth, and shelter. Although life was difficult, moments of quiet happiness still existed. A warm meal, a healthy harvest, or simply seeing every member of the family safe at home could bring genuine joy to people who owned so very little. For countless medieval families, this simple routine continued year after year. They built their lives not upon wealth or comfort, but upon determination, cooperation, and hope that tomorrow would be just a little kinder than today. Every season brought a different challenge. Spring demanded planting, summer required endless labor, autumn was filled with harvesting, and winter tested every family's ability to survive with what they had stored. Keeping food safe was almost as important as growing it. Grain, onions, beans, and dried herbs were carefully stored inside simple wooden chests and clay jars, protected from damp air, hungry mice, and harsh winter weather. Although medieval villages were small, they were close communities. Neighbors borrowed tools, shared labor during harvest, and gathered together during festivals or church celebrations whenever time allowed. Faith was woven deeply into everyday life. Whether hoping for rain, praying for a healthy harvest, or giving thanks for another successful season, many medieval families found comfort inside their local parish church. Life inside a medieval peasant's home was never easy. Yet through hard work, strong family bonds, and endless determination, ordinary people built the foundations of villages, kingdoms, and generations that would shape history for centuries to come. Most medieval peasant families never traveled farther than a few miles from the village where they were born. Their entire world consisted of nearby fields, forests, the parish church, and the local market. Beyond those familiar places, the world remained a mystery known only through stories. Money was rarely seen inside an ordinary peasant's home. Many families paid their rent with grain, chickens, eggs, or days of labor instead of silver coins. Survival mattered far more than wealth. Tools were precious possessions. A single iron axe, a wooden plow, or a sharp farming knife might be used by several generations before finally wearing out. Nothing useful was ever thrown away. Despite the hardships, children still found moments to smile. A handmade wooden toy chasing chickens through the yard or playing with the family dog could turn an ordinary afternoon into a treasured memory. Looking back today, it is easy to imagine medieval life as endlessly bleak. Yet for the people who lived it, this routine was simply normal. Their homes, families, and daily work formed the center of a world they understood and deeply valued. Clothing was made to last for many years. Most peasant families owned only a few simple garments, carefully patched whenever they became worn. New clothes were a rare luxury, often reserved for special occasions or passed down through generations. Bathing was uncommon compared with modern life. Clean water was valuable, and heating enough water for a full bath required time and precious firewood. Most people simply washed their hands and faces whenever they could. Illness was one of the greatest fears in any medieval village. Without modern medicine, families relied on herbs, rest, and the knowledge passed down by local healers. Even a simple infection could become dangerous. Almost everything the family owned had been made by hand. Every wooden chair, clay bowl, woven basket, and linen blanket represented hours of careful work. Handmade objects were not decorations. They were essential for everyday survival. To modern eyes, a medieval peasant's home may seem small and simple, but for the family who lived there, it was a place of warmth, safety, and belonging. A home built through years of patience, sacrifice, and hard work. Years passed quietly in villages like this. Children grew into adults, learned the same skills as their parents, and eventually cared for farms of their own. The rhythm of medieval life changed very little from one generation to the next. Knowledge was rarely written down for ordinary people. Instead, every lesson was passed from parent to child through observation, repetition, and years of shared work in the fields and at home. Although kings, castles, and great battles dominate history books, most people who lived during the Middle Ages experienced life much differently. Their history was written not through war, but through ordinary days filled with work, family, and quiet perseverance. For countless medieval peasants, happiness was measured in simple ways: a healthy harvest, a safe home, enough food for winter, and seeing loved ones together at the end of another long day. And so, another ordinary day inside a medieval peasant's home came to an end. It was a life of constant labor, modest comforts, and unwavering resilience. Though centuries have passed, the quiet determination of families like this remains one of history's most enduring legacies. Not every day was spent in the fields. On certain mornings, families traveled to the village market to trade eggs, vegetables, butter, or handmade goods. It was one of the few chances to meet people from neighboring villages. Life was never completely free. Most peasants owed rent or labor to their local lord. Sometimes payment came in grain, livestock, or several days of work instead of silver coins. Even after paying their obligations, the family returned home determined to make the most of what remained. Every loaf of bread, every handful of grain, and every bundle of firewood had to be carefully managed throughout the year. Despite every hardship, laughter was never completely absent. Families celebrated small victories: a healthy calf, a successful harvest, or simply sharing another peaceful evening together beneath the same roof. Perhaps that is the greatest lesson hidden inside a medieval peasant's home. Happiness was rarely found in comfort or wealth. Instead, it lived quietly in family, shared work, simple meals, and the hope that tomorrow would bring another sunrise. Not every tool could be made at home. From time to time, Thomas visited the village blacksmith, where iron plow blades, horseshoes, axes, and farming knives were repaired. A skilled blacksmith was one of the most respected craftsmen in any medieval village. The weekly market offered more than goods. It was a place where villagers exchanged news, arranged marriages, settled disputes, and learned about events taking place far beyond their own fields. As autumn approached, every family hurried to prepare for winter. Firewood was stacked higher, grain stores were inspected, and vegetables were dried for the long cold months ahead. Winter could be unforgiving. Families carefully counted every sack of grain and every piece of firewood, knowing that running out before spring could bring hunger, illness, or worse. Although medieval life demanded endless effort, families like Thomas's endured through patience, cooperation, and quiet determination. Their story was not one of kings or castles, but of ordinary people whose daily labor kept the medieval world alive. Most peasants rarely owned clocks, yet they always knew when it was time to work. The rising sun, the ringing church bell, and the changing seasons guided every part of their daily routine. Water was one of the most valuable necessities in every village. Every morning, families carried heavy wooden buckets from the communal well, supplying enough water for cooking, washing, and caring for their animals. Water had to be used carefully. Every drop required hard work to collect. so nothing was wasted. Even washing clothes or cleaning cooking pots became an important daily responsibility. Every member of the household had responsibilities. Even the youngest children learned useful skills long before reaching adulthood. Helping the family was simply a normal part of growing up. As another day slowly came to an end, the family once again returned to the warmth of their little home. Life remained difficult, but together they had everything they truly needed: shelter, food, and one another. Not every day was blessed with sunshine. Rain often turned narrow village paths into deep mud, making even the simplest journeys slow and exhausting. Yet the work never stopped because the weather offered no excuses. When heavy rain kept the family indoors, there was still plenty to do. Clothes were mended, tools were repaired, baskets were woven, and tomorrow's work was carefully planned beside the warm fire. Neighbors often relied on one another when difficult times arrived. If a roof leaked or a barn wall collapsed, nearby families would gather to help, knowing they might one day need the same kindness themselves. Community was one of the greatest strengths of village life. No family could survive every hardship alone. Through shared labor and mutual trust, ordinary people endured challenges that would have been impossible to face by themselves. For people living in the Middle Ages, wealth was measured less by gold than by healthy crops, strong friendships, dependable neighbors, and a family waiting safely at home when the day's work was finally done. For many peasant families, winter was the greatest test of the entire year. The fields lay frozen beneath snow, fresh vegetables became scarce, and every meal depended on the grain, dried herbs, and preserved food that had been carefully stored during the autumn harvest. A single mistake in planning could leave an entire household hungry before spring returned. Even during the coldest months, life never truly stopped. Livestock still needed feeding. Firewood had to be gathered, and broken fences required repair after every winter storm. The family simply exchanged long days in the fields for long days battling the cold. Candles were expensive, so most evenings ended shortly after sunset. Families gathered around the glowing hearth, sharing simple meals and quiet conversations, while the fire became their only source of warmth and light. Beyond the cottage walls, the village disappeared into darkness. Children learned valuable lessons not from books, but by watching their parents every single day. They discovered how to grow food, care for animals, repair tools, and survive difficult seasons. These practical skills became their education and prepared them for adult life. Looking back from the modern world, it is easy to focus only on the hardships of medieval peasant life. Yet these ordinary families built strong communities through cooperation, resilience, and determination. Their quiet daily efforts helped sustain villages and kingdoms for generations, leaving behind a legacy far greater than they could ever have imagined. For most peasants, illness was a constant danger. Without modern doctors or medicines, even a small wound or common fever could become life-threatening. Families relied on herbal remedies, experienced healers, and hoped that the body would recover on its own. The village church stood at the center of everyday life. It was more than a place of worship. It served as a meeting place where people celebrated marriages, mourned loved ones, shared important news, and found comfort during difficult times. Nearly every major event in a peasant's life passed through its doors. Entertainment was simple, but meaningful. After long days of work, neighbors gathered to sing old folk songs, tell stories passed down through generations, or enjoy seasonal festivals after a successful harvest. These rare moments of joy helped strengthen the bonds of the community. Although medieval peasants owned very little, they understood the value of every possession. A wooden spoon, a clay bowl, a wool blanket, or a sturdy pair of boots might serve the same family for decades. Nothing useful was ever thrown away if it could be repaired. As another peaceful evening settled over the village, smoke drifted gently from the cottage chimneys. Animals rested quietly in their shelters, and families gathered around their warm hearths. Tomorrow would bring another sunrise, another day of hard work, and another chance to continue the simple but remarkable story of life inside a medieval peasant's home. As winter slowly gave way to spring, the village came alive once again. Birds returned to the hedgerows, fresh grass covered the fields, and every peasant family prepared for another season of planting. A new year had begun, bringing fresh hope along with fresh responsibilities. The first seeds of spring were planted with great care. Every handful of grain placed into the soil represented the family's future. Good weather meant survival, while poor weather could bring months of hardship. Working beside horses or oxen required patience and experience. These animals were among the family's most valuable possessions, helping plow fields that would have been impossible to prepare by hand alone. As crops slowly began to grow, weeds also appeared. Countless hours were spent removing unwanted plants by hand, protecting the precious harvest that would feed the family through the coming year. The village echoed with familiar sounds, hammering from the blacksmith's forge, church bells in the distance, children laughing near the cottages, and birds singing across the open fields. These simple sounds formed the soundtrack of everyday medieval life. Many cottages also kept small vegetable gardens. Cabbages, onions, beans, peas, and herbs provided important nutrition and helped families survive when grain harvests were poor. Every family understood that nature could not be controlled. A late frost, violent storm, or long drought could destroy months of careful work in only a few days. Life depended upon patience and resilience. Despite these uncertainties, neighbors continued helping one another whenever possible. Shared labor made difficult tasks easier and strengthened friendships that often lasted a lifetime. As summer arrived, the days became longer and warmer. Work often began before sunrise and continued until evening, allowing families to make the most of every precious hour of daylight. The midday meal remained simple. Fresh bread, onions, cheese, and cool water provided enough energy before everyone returned to the fields to continue working beneath the warm summer sun. Children gradually became more independent with every passing year. Tasks that once seemed difficult soon became ordinary parts of daily life as they learned by watching their parents. Inside the cottage, Agnes never stopped working. Between cooking, sewing, baking, storing food, and caring for the household, her days were just as demanding as those spent in the fields. When evening finally arrived, tired hands rested only briefly. Tomorrow's tools were prepared, food was stored safely, and plans were quietly made for another busy day ahead. Although history often remembers kings and great battles, the true foundation of medieval society rested upon ordinary families like this one, whose quiet labor supported entire kingdoms. Generation after generation, these traditions continued almost unchanged. Parents taught their children, who later taught their own, preserving knowledge that could never be learned from books alone. Their home may have been small, but it offered something priceless. A place where the family could gather together after long days of work, protected from the outside world. Every season left its mark upon the cottage. New repairs were added, old tools were strengthened, and each passing year quietly became part of the family's history. Looking across the peaceful fields today, it is difficult to imagine the countless lives that unfolded here. Behind every harvest stood families who worked from dawn until dusk with remarkable endurance. The story of medieval peasants is not only a story of hardship, it is also a story of resilience, cooperation, hope, and the quiet determination to build a better future for the next generation. And as another sunset faded beyond the village, the family returned home once again. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new work, and new opportunities. But for tonight, the warmth of the hearth and the comfort of family were more than enough. As the years passed, life inside the medieval peasant's home followed the same steady rhythm. Each sunrise brought familiar responsibilities, and each sunset marked another day of honest labor completed. The changing seasons shaped every decision the family made, reminding them that nature always held the final word. Spring was a season of hope. The frozen ground slowly softened beneath the warming sun. Birds returned to the hedgerows, and green shoots began appearing across the fields. Thomas carefully prepared the soil while William followed behind, scattering precious seeds by hand. Every handful of grain represented the family's future. If the weather remained favorable, these tiny seeds would one day become the bread that filled their table. Summer demanded endless effort. Long before dawn, the family was already awake. Agnes prepared a simple breakfast while Thomas sharpened his tools beside the cottage. As the first light spread across the village, they walked together toward the fields, accompanied by their faithful brown dog. The days were long, the work exhausting, and the hot sun rarely offered mercy, yet no one complained. Hard work was simply a part of life. During the hottest hours of the afternoon, they paused only briefly beneath the shade of an old oak tree. A loaf of dark rye bread, a piece of cheese, and cool water from a wooden flask were enough to restore their strength before returning to work once again. Every hour mattered, because the growing season was short, and every delay reduced the family's chance of a successful harvest. As autumn approached, the village became busier than ever. Fields turned golden beneath the late afternoon sun, and every family worked together gathering the crops before winter arrived. Wagons filled with grain rolled slowly along narrow dirt roads while smoke drifted peacefully from cottage chimneys. There was satisfaction in seeing the harvest safely stored, yet everyone understood that the hardest season still lay ahead. Winter transformed the countryside into a quiet world of frost and snow. The fields rested beneath frozen ground, while families remained close to the warmth of their hearths. Firewood became precious, food stores were carefully measured, and every loaf of bread reminded them of the hard work completed during the warmer months. Although life slowed, it never truly stopped. Animals still required care, tools needed repairing, and tomorrow's work was always waiting. Inside the cottage, evenings were peaceful. The glow of the fire filled the room with warmth. While Agnes repaired clothing and Thomas mended worn wooden tools, William and Alice listened quietly as old stories were shared, stories that had been passed from one generation to the next for hundreds of years. Without books or written records, these memories became the family's greatest inheritance. Perhaps that is what made medieval peasant life so remarkable. It was not filled with castles, knights, or grand adventures. Instead, it was built upon ordinary moments, sharing simple meals, working beside loved ones, helping neighbors during difficult times, and finding happiness in small victories. Their lives were difficult, yet they endured through patience, determination, and the strength of family. Tonight, as darkness settles gently over the village and the last fire begins to fade into glowing embers, the family finally rests. Tomorrow, before the first rays of sunlight reach the fields, they will wake once again and continue the same timeless rhythm that has shaped their lives for generations. Before the first bird called from the hedgerows, Thomas was already awake once again. The cottage was still dark, the fire reduced to glowing embers, and the cool morning air drifted quietly through the tiny gaps in the wooden walls. Agnes carefully added a few pieces of dry firewood to the hearth, and soon a gentle orange flame filled the room with warmth. Another ordinary day had begun. Outside, a thin layer of morning mist covered the fields. The village looked peaceful from a distance, but every family was already preparing for hours of hard work. Wooden doors creaked open, chickens wandered across muddy yards, and smoke slowly curled upward from thatched rooftops. The entire village seemed to wake together, following a rhythm that had remained unchanged for generations. Breakfast was simple, just as it had been the day before. A bowl of warm barley porridge, a few slices of coarse rye bread, and fresh water were enough to begin another demanding morning. No one hurried through the meal. Food was valuable, and every crumb was appreciated because nothing could ever be taken for granted. Soon afterward, Thomas and William walked toward the fields carrying their farming tools across the narrow dirt path. Agnes remained behind for a short while, feeding the chickens, milking the family's cow, and preparing bread dough that would bake later in the day. Alice helped wherever she could, carrying baskets, gathering herbs, and learning the same daily routines that one day would become her own responsibilities. The fields required constant attention. Weeds appeared almost as quickly as the crops themselves, and removing them demanded countless hours of patient work beneath the warm sun. Every healthy plant increased the family's chances of surviving another winter. Every damaged crop represented food that would never reach their table. Around midday, the church bell echoed gently across the countryside. For a brief moment, tools rested on the ground while workers stretched their tired backs and wiped the sweat from their faces. There was little conversation. Everyone understood that the work waiting ahead was far greater than the few minutes of rest they allowed themselves. As afternoon passed, clouds slowly gathered above the distant hills. Thomas looked toward the changing sky with quiet concern. Medieval farmers had no forecasts, no weather reports, and no certainty about tomorrow. Experience taught them to read the wind, the clouds, and the behavior of birds, but nature often surprised even the wisest villagers. Fortunately, the storm drifted away without reaching the fields. The family returned home carrying freshly gathered vegetables, bundles of herbs, and another armful of firewood. Every trip back to the cottage ended the same way. Tools were cleaned, animals were fed, and supplies were carefully placed where they would remain dry and safe. Inside the cottage, the familiar smell of vegetable stew slowly filled the room. Agnes stirred the iron cooking pot hanging above the fire, while Thomas quietly repaired the handle of a wooden shovel that had loosened during the day's work. William stacked firewood beside the hearth, and Alice carefully arranged clay bowls across the heavy wooden table. As darkness settled outside, the family gathered together for another modest meal. They spoke softly about tomorrow's work, the condition of the crops, and the changing weather. There were no grand plans or exciting adventures waiting beyond the horizon. Their greatest wish was simple: that the harvest would remain healthy, the family would stay together, and another peaceful sunrise would arrive in the morning. When the last bowl had been emptied and the fire burned low once again, silence returned to the little cottage. Outside, only the distant sound of an owl and the gentle rustling of leaves disturbed the night. Inside, surrounded by simple wooden walls built through years of patience and hard work, the family drifted peacefully to sleep, ready to begin the same timeless routine again with the coming dawn. The following morning arrived much like every other. A cool breeze drifted across the fields as the first rays of sunlight reached the village rooftops. Dew covered the grass, sparkling like tiny drops of glass, while birds greeted the new day from the ancient oak trees surrounding the cottages. For a brief moment the countryside felt peaceful before the hard work began once again. Thomas stepped outside carrying a wooden hoe over his shoulder. The fresh morning air reminded him that every season moved quickly, and every day lost could never be recovered. William followed closely behind, eager to prove that he was becoming strong enough to help with more difficult tasks. Their loyal brown dog ran happily along the narrow path, occasionally stopping to sniff the damp ground before catching up again. Back inside the cottage, Agnes carefully kneaded bread dough while Alice swept the earthen floor using a handmade straw broom. Small daily chores like these rarely appeared in history books, yet they were essential for keeping the household running. Every member of the family contributed in some way, no matter how young or old they were. The vegetable garden beside the cottage demanded almost as much attention as the larger fields. Rows of cabbage, onions, beans, peas, and herbs had to be watered, protected from hungry animals, and carefully harvested at the proper time. Nothing was planted without purpose. Every crop played a role in helping the family survive another year. As the sun climbed higher into the sky, the village became increasingly busy. Farmers crossed paths carrying tools, women exchanged greetings while collecting water from the well, and children huddled between cottages delivering small baskets or helping their parents. Although each family focused on its own work, the entire village moved together like the parts of a single living community. By midday, Thomas paused beside the edge of the field to examine the growing grain. He gently rubbed several heads of wheat between his fingers, checking their progress with practiced eyes. Experience had taught him to notice even the smallest changes. A healthy crop brought quiet confidence, while signs of disease or insects could quickly fill a family with worry. Meanwhile, Agnes prepared a simple midday meal beneath the shade of a large tree. Fresh bread baked that morning, a small piece of cheese, onions, and cool water were carefully shared between everyone. There was no waste. Leftover crumbs were collected for the chickens, and nothing edible was thrown away. Later that afternoon, William helped repair one of the wooden fences surrounding the family's pasture. Loose boards were carefully nailed back into place using simple iron nails that had been forged by the village blacksmith years before. Alice gathered fallen branches nearby, adding them to the growing pile of firewood that would be needed once colder weather returned. As evening approached, long shadows stretched across the fields. The family slowly walked home together, tired but satisfied after another productive day. Their faithful dog trotted ahead, already knowing the familiar path that led back to the cottage. Smoke rose gently from neighboring homes as other families also finished their work and prepared supper. Once again, the warm glow of the hearth became the center of the household. Thomas quietly sharpened his tools for tomorrow, while Agnes stirred another pot of vegetable stew. William and Alice listened as their parents spoke about planting schedules, changing weather, and the work still waiting in the days ahead. There was comfort in these ordinary conversations because they reminded everyone that despite life's many hardships, they faced every challenge together. Outside, darkness slowly settled over the village. One by one, the lights inside neighboring cottages disappeared, until only the stars remained above the silent countryside. Another day had ended exactly as so many others before it, leaving behind no great battles or famous victories, only the quiet success of a family that had worked hard, cared for one another, and lived another ordinary day in medieval England. As the weeks passed, the family's routine rarely changed, but no 2 days were ever exactly the same. Nature constantly presented new challenges. One morning brought bright sunshine, while the next arrived beneath heavy gray clouds. Every change in the weather demanded new decisions, and experience often mattered more than strength. The fields surrounding the village slowly transformed as the crops continued to grow. Young green shoots became tall golden stalks, gently swaying in the summer breeze. Thomas often stopped for a moment to admire the fields, knowing that every healthy plant represented weeks of careful work and countless hours beneath the open sky. William was no longer simply following his father. With each passing season, he took on greater responsibility. He learned how deeply to plant seeds, how to recognize unhealthy crops, and how to guide the family's ox across the uneven ground. Thomas rarely needed to explain things anymore. His son had begun learning through observation, just as he himself had done many years before. Alice spent more time beside Agnes each day. She learned how to bake coarse rye bread, prepare simple vegetable soups, dry herbs for winter, and repair worn clothing with careful stitches. Every skill she mastered strengthened the entire household, because every member of the family depended upon one another. The family's brown dog remained a constant companion. It followed Thomas into the fields every morning, waited patiently beside the cottage while Agnes worked, and watched over the children as they gathered eggs or carried water from the village well. Though it never spoke a word, its quiet loyalty became part of the family's everyday life. Occasionally, traveling merchants passed through the village bringing unusual goods from distant towns. Bright pieces of cloth, polished metal tools, colorful glass beads, and rare spices caught the attention of curious villagers. Thomas admired these objects from a distance, but he knew such luxuries belonged to another world. His family's priorities remained simple: food, shelter, healthy animals, and enough grain to survive another winter. Some evenings, after the day's work was finished, neighbors gathered outside their cottages to exchange stories. They spoke about weather, harvests, newborn animals, and memories passed down from older generations. These conversations carried knowledge that no written book could provide. Each story helped younger villagers better understand the land and the seasons that shaped their lives. As summer slowly faded, the air became cooler during the early mornings. Leaves along the edges of the forest began showing the first hints of gold and red. Everyone understood what this meant. Harvest season was approaching once again, bringing the busiest weeks of the entire year. Thomas carefully inspected every tool before the harvest began. Sickles were sharpened until their blades gleamed in the sunlight. Wooden handles were tightened, ropes were replaced, and carts were repaired. A broken tool during harvest could waste precious hours when every minute mattered. Inside the cottage, Agnes prepared extra sacks, baskets, and storage jars. Shelves were cleaned, wooden chests inspected, and every empty space was made ready for the grain that would soon arrive. The entire household seemed to prepare together, each person quietly performing their own task without needing to be reminded. As the sun slowly disappeared behind the distant hills, warm golden light spread across the fields one final time. Thomas stood quietly beside his family outside their little cottage, looking across the land they had worked so faithfully throughout the year. There was still much to do before winter arrived, but for this brief moment they allowed themselves to appreciate the peace surrounding their humble home. The fire burned gently inside the cottage that evening, filling the room with familiar warmth. Outside, the village settled into silence once again. Tomorrow would begin another chapter in the same timeless story. A story not of kings or castles, but of ordinary people whose patience, courage, and unwavering determination quietly shaped the medieval world. Harvest season finally arrived, bringing with it the busiest days of the entire year. From the first light of dawn until the last glow of sunset, every family in the village worked with quiet determination. There was no time to waste. The weather could change without warning, and every field needed to be cleared before heavy rain or early frost damaged the crops. Thomas rose before anyone else and stepped outside into the cool morning air. A gentle mist covered the fields, and the golden wheat stretched toward the horizon like a calm sea. For a brief moment, everything was perfectly still. Then, one by one, the village came to life. Doors opened, carts rolled onto the narrow roads, and farmers began another long day beneath the rising sun. William carried bundles of rope while his father sharpened the family's sickles one last time. Agnes packed bread, cheese, onions, and fresh water into a wicker basket for the midday meal. Alice gathered empty grain sacks, carefully folding each one so it could hold as much wheat as possible. Even the family's faithful brown dog seemed to sense that today was different, following everyone closely as they walked toward the fields. The work was slow and repetitive. Each handful of grain had to be cut by hand, tied into neat bundles and carried to the waiting cart. Hour after hour the family repeated the same careful movements. Their backs ached, their hands became rough, and the summer sun grew hotter overhead, yet no one complained. Every bundle added to the cart brought them one step closer to a successful harvest. Around them, neighboring families worked just as hard. Across the fields, laughter occasionally drifted through the air as villagers encouraged one another to keep going. Children carried water to tired workers, while older men shared advice gained through decades of experience. The entire countryside seemed united by one common purpose. When the church bell rang at midday, everyone stopped for a short rest beneath the shade of a large oak tree. Thomas removed his hat and quietly looked across the nearly harvested field. There was satisfaction in seeing the work completed, but he also understood that many more days remained before every crop would be safely stored. After the meal, work began again without delay. Clouds slowly gathered above the western hills, and a cool breeze swept across the wheat. Every farmer noticed the changing sky. If rain arrived before sunset, unfinished grain could quickly become damp and difficult to store. With renewed energy, the family worked faster, carefully loading the final bundles onto the wooden cart. Fortunately, the storm never reached the village. Instead, the evening sun broke through the clouds, covering the countryside with warm golden light. As Thomas guided the heavily loaded cart back toward the cottage, William walked proudly beside him. The harvest had been successful, and for the first time in many weeks, everyone allowed themselves to feel a quiet sense of relief. Back at home, Agnes and Alice carefully carried the grain into the storage shed, placing every sack where it would remain dry throughout the winter. Thomas inspected the roof, making sure no rain could enter, while William stacked the remaining bundles neatly against the wooden wall. Their faithful dog rested nearby, watching every movement with calm eyes. As darkness slowly settled across the village, smoke rose gently from the chimneys of dozens of cottages. Families gathered around warm hearths, sharing simple meals after another exhausting day. The fields outside were finally quiet again, waiting patiently for the changing seasons to begin the endless cycle once more. For Thomas and his family, the harvest was never the end of their work. It was simply another chapter in a life built upon patience, perseverance, and hope. Tomorrow, new tasks would begin, just as they always had, and the timeless rhythm of medieval village life would continue beneath another peaceful sunrise. With the harvest safely stored, life inside the village became slightly quieter, but work never truly ended. The fields now stood empty beneath the fading autumn sun, yet every family remained busy preparing for the long winter ahead. Firewood needed to be stacked, fences repaired, roofs inspected, and every corner of the cottage made ready for the cold months that would soon arrive. Each morning, Thomas walked into the nearby woodland, carrying nothing more than an axe and a length of rope. Fallen branches were gathered first, saving the larger trees whenever possible. Firewood was too valuable to waste. Every log carried home would one day provide warmth for the family during freezing nights when snow covered the countryside. Meanwhile, Agnes spent her days preserving as much food as possible. Apples were sliced and dried above the hearth. Herbs were tied into neat bundles and hung from the rafters, while onions and garlic were carefully braided together before being stored in cool corners of the cottage. Clay jars filled with beans, peas, and grains lined the wooden shelves, each one representing security for the difficult months ahead. William had become strong enough to help split firewood beside his father. Although his hands were still small, he worked carefully, learning how to strike each piece of timber safely and efficiently. Thomas rarely needed to correct him now. Years of quiet observation had slowly turned the curious boy into a capable young worker. Alice remained close to her mother, mastering skills that required patience rather than strength. She learned how to spin wool into thread, repair torn clothing, bake coarse bread, and keep the small cottage clean despite the endless mud brought inside on worn leather boots. These simple tasks rarely attracted attention, yet without them, daily life would quickly become far more difficult. As colder winds swept across the fields, the animals also demanded greater care. The family's cow received extra hay each evening. chickens were brought safely into their wooden co-op before sunset, and the small goat was sheltered inside the barn whenever heavy rain arrived. Healthy animals meant milk, eggs, and food. Losing even one could place enormous strain upon the household. The village itself also changed with the season. The lively sounds of harvest slowly faded, replaced by quieter routines. Smoke rose almost constantly from cottage chimneys as families gathered indoors more often. The narrow dirt roads became softer beneath frequent rain, and travelers appeared less frequently than they had during the warmer months. One evening, Thomas paused outside before entering the cottage. The air carried the unmistakable scent of approaching winter. Leaves drifted silently from the ancient oak trees, and flocks of birds crossed the darkening sky as they began their long journey south. Nature offered gentle reminders that another season was drawing to a close. Inside, the familiar glow of the hearth welcomed the family once again. Agnes stirred a pot of thick vegetable stew while fresh bread baked slowly beside the fire. William carefully cleaned the family's farming tools before placing them against the wall, and Alice folded newly repaired blankets into a wooden chest. Their faithful brown dog stretched comfortably beside the warm stones of the fireplace, completely at peace. As supper came to an end, conversation turned toward the months ahead. Thomas quietly counted the remaining sacks of grain, while Agnes estimated how long their dried vegetables might last. No one expected luxury. Their goal was far simpler: to remain healthy, protect one another, and welcome spring when it finally returned. Outside, darkness settled gently across the sleeping village. A cold wind whispered through the bare branches, but inside the little cottage, the family rested together in quiet comfort. They could not know what the coming winter would bring, yet they faced it with the same courage and determination that had guided countless medieval families for generations. As winter settled firmly over the countryside, the pace of life grew slower, but the work remained constant. Frost covered the fields each morning, turning every blade of grass white beneath the pale sunlight. The earth rested quietly beneath the frozen ground, waiting for the warmth of spring to awaken it once again. For Thomas and his family, these peaceful months became a time of careful preparation rather than farming. Most days began before sunrise. Agnes rekindled the fire using dry kindling saved from the autumn, while Thomas checked the animals inside the barn. Their cow, chickens, and small goat depended entirely upon the family during the harsh weather. Fresh hay was placed into feeding troughs. Water buckets were broken free from thin layers of ice, and every animal was examined carefully for signs of illness. Losing livestock during winter could be just as devastating as losing an entire harvest. Inside the cottage, life centered around the warmth of the hearth. Firewood was added sparingly, never more than necessary. Every log represented hours of labor spent gathering and cutting timber before winter arrived. The family understood that their supply needed to last until the first mild days of spring. Flames burned steadily throughout the evening, filling the room with gentle warmth while shadows danced across the timber walls. Without fields demanding constant attention, Thomas finally found time to repair the tools that had served the family throughout the year. Wooden handles were replaced, iron blades were sharpened, and loose joints were carefully strengthened with handmade pegs. These quiet hours of maintenance ensured that everything would be ready when planting season returned. Nothing was discarded simply because it had become worn. Every useful object deserved another chance. Agnes remained equally busy. She spun wool into thread, repaired winter cloaks, and carefully inspected every blanket for holes that might allow cold air inside during freezing nights. Alice eagerly copied each movement, learning that patience and skill were just as valuable as physical strength. These lessons would remain with her for the rest of her life, passed one day to another generation. William often accompanied his father into the nearby woodland whenever weather permitted. Together they gathered fallen branches and searched for dead trees suitable for firewood. The forest looked completely different beneath winter skies. Bare branches stretched toward the clouds, animal tracks crossed fresh snow, and the silence seemed deeper than during any other season. Even so, the woodland remained an important source of warmth and survival. Occasionally, travelers arrived at the village despite the difficult roads. News from distant towns spread quickly from cottage to cottage. Stories of harsh winters, successful markets, or unusual events offered rare glimpses into a world far beyond the familiar fields surrounding the village. For a brief evening, conversation replaced silence before ordinary life quietly resumed. As another winter evening came to an end, the family gathered around the glowing fire. After sharing a simple meal of bread, vegetable stew, and preserved onions, outside snowflakes drifted silently across the sleeping village, covering rooftops, fences, and empty fields beneath a blanket of white. Inside the cottage, however, there was warmth, quiet conversation, and the comforting knowledge that another day had been safely completed. Although tomorrow would look much like today, the family welcomed it with the same steady determination that had carried medieval peasants through countless winters for centuries. When the first signs of spring finally returned, the entire village seemed to breathe again. The snow slowly disappeared from the fields, streams began flowing freely once more, and tiny green shoots pushed through the dark earth. Months of careful waiting had finally come to an end. For Thomas and his family, this was not simply the arrival of warmer weather, it was the beginning of another year of hard work. The family's first task was to inspect the land after winter. Strong winds had damaged sections of the wooden fence, while melting snow had softened parts of the dirt paths leading to the fields. Together, Thomas and William repaired broken fence posts, replaced loose rails, and cleared fallen branches that had collected during the winter storms. Every repair completed now would save valuable time later in the growing season. Inside the cottage, Agnes carefully opened the wooden chests where seeds had been stored throughout the winter. Each small cloth sack contained precious grain, beans, peas, and vegetables that would soon be planted. She inspected every seed with great care, knowing that healthy crops began long before they reached the soil. Alice watched closely, learning how every decision affected the family's future harvest. Soon, the familiar sound of the village blacksmith echoed through the air once again. Farmers from every corner of the village arrived, carrying worn plow blades, broken axes, and damaged horseshoes. Sparks flew from the glowing forge as iron was shaped beneath heavy hammers. Thomas waited patiently for his turn, exchanging quiet conversations with neighbors while the blacksmith restored the tools that would soon return to the fields. The church bell rang across the village on a clear Sunday morning, calling families together after the long winter. Villagers greeted one another warmly, sharing stories of how they had endured the cold months. Children who had spent much of the winter indoors laughed together in the churchyard, while older farmers discussed the condition of the soil and wondered whether the coming harvest would be generous. Back at the cottage, preparations continued without pause. The ox was brushed and fitted with its wooden yoke, carts were inspected for loose wheels, and every farming tool was placed neatly beside the doorway, ready for another season. Their faithful brown dog wandered happily around the yard, as if it too sensed that life outside the cottage was becoming busy once again. One bright morning, Thomas stepped into the field carrying the first sack of seed. He paused for a moment, looking across the land that had fed his family for so many years. There was no guarantee that the coming season would be successful. A single storm, a late frost, or weeks without rain could undo months of careful work. Yet uncertainty had always been part of a peasant's life. Hope and hard work were the only things he truly controlled. As planting began once more, the rhythm of the village returned exactly as it had for generations. Farmers worked side by side beneath the open sky. Women tended gardens and households. Children learned by watching their parents, and every family quietly contributed to the survival of the community. No one expected an easy life. Their greatest reward was seeing the fields slowly turn green once again. When evening arrived, Thomas and his family walked back toward their little cottage beneath the warm colors of the setting sun behind them. Freshly planted fields stretched across the countryside, filled with the promise of another growing season ahead of them. Smoke curled gently from the cottage chimney, where another simple meal waited beside the glowing hearth. For people living in medieval England, life was measured not by years, but by seasons. Every spring offered hope, every summer demanded effort, every autumn rewarded patience, and every winter tested endurance. Through this endless cycle, ordinary families quietly built lives of remarkable resilience. Lives that, though rarely recorded in history books, formed the very foundation of the medieval world. The weeks passed steadily, and the tiny green shoots that had emerged from the soil slowly transformed into healthy fields of grain. Every morning, Thomas walked through the crops with careful eyes, searching for signs of insects, disease, or damaged plants. A successful harvest depended upon constant attention. Even a few neglected days could undo months of patient work. William had grown noticeably stronger since the previous year. Tasks that once seemed impossible were now completed with quiet confidence. He could guide the ox across the field, repair simple wooden tools, and carry heavy bundles of firewood without stopping to rest. Thomas rarely spoke while they worked together, but he watched proudly as his son gradually became a capable farmer. Alice's responsibilities also continued to grow. Each morning she helped Agnes collect fresh eggs, milk the family cow, and gather vegetables from the garden beside the cottage. She carefully learned which herbs could flavor food, which could help ease illness, and which should never be touched at all. Every lesson came through observation, repetition, and experience rather than written instruction. The village itself remained closely connected. If one farmer finished repairing a roof, he often crossed the road to help a neighbor finish another. When someone's cart broke along the muddy road, nearby villagers stopped their own work to lend a hand. Cooperation was not simply kindness, it was necessary for survival. Everyone understood that tomorrow they might be the ones needing assistance. During the warm summer evenings, the pace of life briefly slowed. Families gathered outside their cottages while children played across the grassy commons. Older villagers shared stories about harsh winters, great harvests, and unusual events they had witnessed decades before. These quiet conversations preserved the memory of the village long before anyone thought of writing its history. Although life remained peaceful most days, uncertainty never disappeared completely. Dark clouds gathering along the horizon could bring destructive hail within a single afternoon. A long dry spell threatened the growing crops, while too much rain could flood the lower fields. Every glance toward the sky carried both hope and concern. Medieval farmers accepted that some things would always remain beyond human control. As midsummer arrived, wildflowers covered the edges of the fields, and bees moved tirelessly between blossoms. Birds nested beneath the roofs of cottages, while swallows darted gracefully through the evening air hunting insects. Nature surrounded the family every moment of the day, providing beauty alongside constant reminders that the changing seasons governed every aspect of their lives. One afternoon, Thomas paused beside the old oak tree overlooking the fields. From there he could see nearly the entire village. Smoke drifted gently from cottage chimneys, farmers worked in distant fields, children carried water from the village well, and the stone church stood quietly at the center of it all. There were no great monuments, no magnificent palaces, and no famous heroes. Yet this simple community had endured for generations through patience, cooperation, and honest labor. As another peaceful day drew to a close, the family returned home together. Their faithful brown dog ran happily ahead along the familiar dirt path, disappearing briefly before waiting beside the cottage gate. Agnes placed fresh bread upon the table while Alice lit a small candle as daylight slowly faded. William stacked tomorrow's tools neatly against the wall, ready for another early start. Outside, the last golden light disappeared beyond the rolling hills, leaving the village wrapped in peaceful silence. Inside the little cottage, the warmth of the hearth, the comfort of family, and the satisfaction of another day's honest work reminded Thomas that, although life was never easy, there was quiet happiness to be found in simple things. And with that comforting thought, another ordinary day in medieval England gently came to its end.